Hi, Dr. Versalati here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the reading with you and go over, kind of highlight what I think is most important. I'd like to start with this figure from the Brown book. Just take a moment and reflect on what you think Brown is trying to express with this. So, to me, this really resonates in that it's showing me that in the whole realm of teaching, which we have a lot of different things we do when we teach, but a big part of that is assessment. And if you think about that, every time we talk to our students, or nearly every time, or even to children or coworkers, when we're trying to teach something, we reflexively almost assess formally or informally if they are picking up what we're trying to teach them. And a smaller part of that is testing. But it's all part of teaching. Teaching separated, this shows that teaching is not separate from assessment, and assessment is not separate from teaching. Good teaching includes authentic, intrinsically motivating assessment procedures that are appropriate for their context and designed to offer constructive feedback to students. So throughout the class, we just want to kind of start with this framework rather than maybe some of the rhetoric in the public sphere about how terrible testing is for students. That's not what we're going to focus on, or that's not going to be the framework we focus on here. The framework is that good teaching includes good assessment. Okay, so what am I going to talk about in this screencast? Well, we're going to talk about what is a test, what's the two main functions of the assessment, focusing on summative and formative, and then I want to talk about 4 principles or qualities of assessment: practicality, reliability, validity, and beneficial consequences. And I want to focus on those because that's what these 4, we're going to focus on these whenever we do reflections, and in our final portfolio we're going to measure or evaluate each of our items in our portfolio in these 4 qualities and see if we can create a balanced portfolio. We'll talk more about the portfolio later. I just want to stress how important that the formative and summative and these 4 qualities of assessment are. Okay, first, what is a test? Well, Brown defines it as a method of measuring a person's ability, knowledge, or performance in a given domain. Seems like a short definition, but let's break it down. A method has to be an instrument or a set of techniques or procedures or items. This must be explicit and structured. What do I mean by that? Multiple choice questions have to have a prescribed correct answer. A writing prompt with a scoring rubric, an interview with a checklist, right? It has to be clear and structured, that the method matches with what we're going to do. It must be explicit and structured in a designed way. So measuring, we're going to measure something. A person's ability, knowledge, or performance. Let's focus on person first. We have to understand who our test takers are. What are their previous experience? Is the test relevant to the testee's abilities? Is it matched for it? Is it plausible, right? It's very important in this course to know who the students are, what the context is. We can't really evaluate an assessment until we know who is going to be taking it. And from the measuring of a person's ability, knowledge, or performance, we infer that person's competence. We really can't ever directly measure competence. We can only measure the performance or the knowledge based on their performance on a test. and then the last part here, in a given domain. And what I mean there is it could be very general, like I want to measure the person's language proficiency. Or it could be very, and you might choose specific items to measure that, trying to see what would represent their global proficiency. Or it might be very, very specific, like just their writing skills or just their pronunciation skills. Okay, so two big functions of the assessment. For summative is maybe what most people think of when they think of an assessment, and the goal is to measure or summarize what the student has learned. And these results can be used to make placement decisions, college acceptance letters, grades, passing, failing, things like that. For formative assessments, the goal is to evaluate the students who are in the process of forming their competencies and skills in order to help them to continue to improve. The stress is more on giving appropriate feedback on the performance to help future learning. So if you were to do a figure or some sort of concept map, what might that look like to help us remember formative and summative? Well, I like to use arrows. So for summative, the assessment is kind of looking backwards on the learning that had happened. And in formative, the assessment is looking forward into what the future learning should be. And in business, you might hear people saying like plan, do, check, right? We make a plan, we do it, we check, and then we repeat the cycle, right? We want to check to keep learning, keep that going on the right course. So two things. Summative assessment, we're looking backwards at what learning had happened, and formative assessment is the assessment is taking place today to think about what we need to do tomorrow, or even in the next minute or in the next afternoon. And let's see. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the qualities of effective assessment a lot in the course. And here are practicality, reliability, validity, and beneficial consequences. We're going to talk about each of them in their turn, but I like to first explain this figure. I think practicality is the most important, because the absolute perfect test that nobody can afford or nobody has time to give, or the students don't have time or resources to take, won't ever be used. So it has to be practical. We're all very, very busy. So practicality can be defined as the difference between resources available and the resources required to develop and use the assessment. And we're going to be very practical in this class and think about how we as classroom instructors, do we have time to create and use the test, and how long will that take, and how long will it take to conduct the test and things like that. Now I colored that green mostly because, if it's practical, it's going to go. Now the next one is reliability on the building blocks. The reliability, some books talk about it as, if it will be consistent, right? If two students with an A in level 4, they should be both equally prepared for level 5 if the assessments in your class are reliable. If the student takes it on Monday and they take the same exam on Tuesday, it's a reliable test if they get statistically similar scores. Okay, so reliable, consistency. Then there's validity, which is a little bit more difficult concept to discuss. We're going to talk about that in the next screencast. But it's how much the test measures the construct that we want it to be measuring. And then the top one for our purposes for this class is beneficial consequences. And we're going to use that. Brown doesn't use that term specifically. He uses a lot of different terms that kind of all encompass this. So, for instance, he uses consequential validity, and that he defines that as all the consequences or the impact, the effect of the testing on the teaching and the learning. And I like to think about that as the preparation of the test takers, right? The teachers lead students in lessons and tasks and discussions, all to move them to be ready to take the assessment. But this can also be student-led, right? Knowing that a test is coming up, they might study and things like this. Another term, we have a whole bunch. The other terms that Brown uses is washback and feedback and authenticity, and these are all going to go into the idea of beneficial consequences. Let's see how this... Okay, so let's focus on washback here, and we'll just get rid of... Okay, let's focusing on washback, the effect of testing on the teaching and learning. Again, this also sounds like preparation. And this can be negative, like teaching to the test. But since we're calling this beneficial consequences, I want to focus here on how knowing how you're going to be assessed has a positive effect on your learning. And I want to give this example. When I was teaching a course for international teaching assistants, there was a lot of practice in pronunciation, because that's their whole, they wanted to pass the pronunciation. And one of the teachers, the other teachers, did a small experiment where she taught the students how spent a lot of time reviewing the rubric of how they would be assessed on their pronunciation. And she had them self-assess and really get used to the rubric. And she found that that had a lot of washback on their actual pronunciation. So again, it's going to be a beneficial consequence if you know how they're going. If I'm going to be assessed, I'd like to know how I'm going to be assessed. And knowing how I'm being tested will probably likely help me in my performance. Okay, so another beneficial consequence of assessment is feedback, right? We want to give feedback that increases the chances that the student will learn. And authenticity. There has been a big trend that we want language assessment to be authentic, and we can do that by thinking about what will this language learner need to do, when would the language learner, or when would we do skill X in the real world, and then how might we assess it in the classroom. And this has come about a lot with the use of performance-based assessment. Okay, so those are the 4 qualities of effective assessment that we're going to be focusing on: practicality, reliability, validity, and beneficial consequences. And I'm looking forward to going more in depth on validity.